Hello everyone. Thank you for pressing play on this video. This will be an introductory to the I Ching as a series of videos. This first video is going to be about the history and the origins behind the Yi. But I will present a comprehensive approach to how to use the Yi, how to ask it questions, all of those other components in a separate series of videos, the subject matter, forming the hexagrams, and the appendices. But for this first video, I'd like to go over the history and the origins behind the Yi, as it does make a difference when you focus on the core text. And the core text is ultimately the most important component. And it is the part that most people will be reading. Although there are many translations of the book. But it's important to understand that before the book existed, there were still the figures, and this plays an important role in understanding how the person, or in this case, two persons, were using these lines to understand the universe. So the first hurdle to get over is the Confucian component. So I have here the dates of which Confucius was alive, and it's estimated that the Yi was first composed and assembled, at least in the form that we know it now, about 1000 BC, 1100 BC. It's not known exactly. There's a lot of debates, but as you can see, there's a good half a millennia of time in between that time and then Confucius. Now, Confucius did do a bulk of, and the bulk of the appendices, which I will get to, are attributed to him, but it's important to understand that you don't need to understand the Yi by relying on the Confucian philosophy or interpretation of how the book is used. So I would like to just get that out of the way. And I apologize if the text is a little bit hard to read. This is my first video, but I hope to improve this further. But here, so again, the I Ching, or I'm just going to be calling it the Yi here, is assumed to have existed before Confucius. And I spelled Confucius wrong. So there were three methods originally. At least that's what's been documented in the book of Zhao. And the book of Zhao is the text that it's sort of a historic, it's like an assemblage of all these volumes that document major historical events during the Zhao dynasty, which is the dynasty in which Confucius was around for. And it's in the book they describe that there were other methods, but over time we have lost them. So but it is kind of interesting to think about potentially other ways, other interpretations of looking at the hexagrams, um, as well as tr- potentially even the trigrams, at least for what they mean. Although it is known that the trigrams uh, are of much older strata than the hexagrams are. And so, yeah, all of these methods did focus on combining the 8 trigrams into the hexagrams. So the primary author of the core text is King Wen of the Zhao dynasty. And his component is also sometimes known as the Thuan, or the Tuan, or sometimes it's not given a name, but it is the sort of the main component that has that oracle kind of leaning in how it's writing or how it's written. Uh, right, this is where you get the good fortune, bad fortune writing. So in this historical context, it's important to know that before or before the Zhao dynasty, there was the Shang dynasty, and the ruler at the end of this dynasty was his name was King Shu or Yi Xin, and he his character plays an important role in definitely in the psyche of King Wen when he was working out these judgments for each of the figures, and uh, his son King Wu, the Duke of Zhao, his speech was recorded, and it's known as the Solemn Declaration. And the way that he referred to the king is that he treats all virtue with contemptuous slight. Um, so there, there was clearly a crisis happening in the way that people were viewing the ruler, um, and it wasn't really totally set in stone that the ruler had to be this paragon of virtue, right? There was a lot of wars, and many kingdoms were established through dominance, but it was clearly a component in how um, King Wen's son was criticizing King Shu. And so a couple of stories about King Shu. So this first one about enduring the cold. There was one day when he saw these Chinese workmen. They were in the river, um, and it was a cold day, and he was perplexed or um, intrigued by their ability to be in the river. And so he ordered that these um, people be rounded up and their legs be cut into the ankle so that they could cut into the marrow and see what it looked like in their bones. He was also known for his decadent lifestyle, which there is a story that he had a moat, or not a moat, a pool, a man made pool or pond that he would fill with wine. And him and his buddies would all get together in these canoes. And in the center, there was an island that they would circle around in the canoes. And when they would want to drink, they would just even just take their hands, and just drink the wine out of the pool. But also in the center of the pool was an island that had sticks, and on the sticks were uh, cubes of meat, and so they could also just pull meat off of these sticks and consume it. And then uh, let me see if I can move this. I got cut off. Another story is that he had an uncle who was a sage. And so the sages were very important to the Chinese religion at the time. And one of his uncles uh, was a sage. And the sage's name is, or was Begon. And he, during this time, was attempting to try to plead with the king to um, change his ways or abandon his ways in favor of um, acting in a different manner. And the king decided to investigate. He wanted to see what a sage's heart would look like, and so he. Sorry, I was just about to sneeze there. I think it's gone now. So he ordered that the sage's heart should be removed. He ordered for the sage's heart to be removed so that he could investigate this and cut out of his body. Um, and then the last story is about this device that the king had devised to entertain his wife, who supposedly she was also an incredibly cruel uh, woman. And so this device, the heater or the roaster, it's consisted of a brass um, rod that would be laid across a bed of hot coals and then coated, and it would be coated in oil to make it very slippery. And they would send prisoners or just uh, people who were a nuisance to either the king or his wife, and they would send them to walk across this rod. So in contrast to this, King Wen, he was known as somebody who was a diplomat, and even in kingdoms that weren't uh, his own, he was someone that was consulted, and clearly he had some understanding of the oracle system at the time, and potentially even before the I Ching had been developed in the way that we see it now, he had already been figuring out ways to help out his contemporaries at the time, which right, that made people respect him, and that made him a highly valuable person. So he was somebody who could operate even when there was war, also when there was peace, which was not something that was and still is to this day not something that many rulers can claim to do. A big part of him is that he was very restrained, and the restraint aspect you can really see in the I Ching, and it's interesting to think about a king who has restraint, um, as generally when we imagine what kings are, uh, most I think most people imagine the more notorious ones, and but I guess a lot of the I Ching does help to understand what it would be like to be a restrained king. And another thing is that he did have many people who would have followed him if he decided to do some kind of military uh, undertaking or to invade King Shu. But it's never been known. But he decided against it, and probably there was a hope in him that this king would change his ways, and he saw no need to have to do something that drastic. Now, um, so this is the way that we've come to know, at least how the Yi was, or the moment at which the Yi was had begun its construction. Perhaps it was not actually finished um, while these events took place, but this is where the beginning of creation occurred. So King Wen, he was imprisoned, and it was not. It's important to understand. It wasn't because he was outwardly criticizing the king. He was in the background com- constructing ways in which perhaps things could improve um, for the dynasty, and that this King Shu could be replaced, but he wasn't outwardly criticizing him. And the solemn declaration that I showed earlier, that happened after. Anyway, so um, so while he was imprisoned, this is when he began to draw the lines, and you can imagine that the guards there were probably um, enthused, or uh, even in some cases possibly supporting towards the king in him making these lines. And it seems like this was something that he consumed the majority of his time with while he was there. Now, an interesting thing is that the order of the hexagrams is preserved from the way that King Wen had them laid out, but the writings that are about that sequence, which I will get to again in the appendices, those are not attributed to King Wen, which is a little bit confusing. They're written by Confucius, or um, potentially another author, maybe one of Confucius's students, but they're doing an attempt at interpreting why the sequence is the way that it is. And out of this work is that each separate figure did receive a short paragraph. In some cases, very, very, very short, but very illuminating and also mysterious. There was no need for the king to write out something in some kind of philosophy. This was definitely a tool that he was attempting to create and use for his divination. And again, this is cut off slightly, but yeah. So, yeah. So the king was eventually released, King Wen, from prison because he was so well liked, and King Shu had to capitulate. And once he was released, King Wen began to ramp up his efforts to um, uh, unite the other kingdoms in their effort to overthrow this dynasty. Um, Unfortunately, before this was not completed before the time of his passing. But his son did continue to uh, command the army, and he would end up going to overthrow the Shang dynasty, and this would then lead to the Zhao dynasty, which would then rule for centuries after. And the I Ching was something that was um, well known, and became well known during this dynasty. Um, but also he did continue the Yi as well, and the other half of the core text are is the text for each of the lines, and these are, I'll get into this later, but uh, in an interesting way, there was a bit of a tension where each line had to mean something different, but it also had to align with the interpretation of the hexagram as a whole. And it's perfect that his son was the person to undertake this project, especially after um, uh, continuing his father's legacy of establishing what would become a new dynasty, and also establish what would become then this concept of the mandate of heaven, which clearly is something that King Wen also uh, was concerned about, again with his um, concept of the king needing to have some sense, some understanding of having virtue, and being a role model. Okay, so that is the end of this first video. Okay, good. It wasn't too long. Um, so I will continue to uh, probably in the next week or 2 weeks upload the next component here, which will be, I think, longer, and um, yeah, we'll get into like the serious meat of interpreting the text. But again, you might pick up some books, and they might even say in the foreword that they've attempted to make the text more or less feudal. Oh, here goes my light. But in my opinion, if you can understand the character of the authors who wrote the core text, then it's not necessary actually to remove the feudalistic or I guess this isn't medieval in European times, but we could call ancient feudalistic kind of way of living. But I actually I don't really think it's necessary. I think as long as you just um, keep in mind and can kind of establish that uh, I don't know, understanding of the author, and establish that bond with them, then it does provide a better understanding of uh, how you can then take that and apply it to yourself. Okay, so I will see you later.